Hi, good morning everyone. We're starting the session now. Just to introduce myself, I'm Hena and I manage digital engagement and marketing at Indian School of Public Policy. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time. As you all know, today we have Sebastien Hug as our guest speaker. Sebastien Hug, this is a consulate journal and CEO of Swissnex India, Switzerland's consulate journal in Bangalore. In his capacity, Sebastien is since November 2018 a dynamic and dedicated team with a mission to connect the dots between Switzerland and India in education, research, and innovation, and to ensure a strong presence of Switzerland in southern India. Previously, from 2013 to 2017, he was scientific advisor at the State Secretariat for Education, Research, and Innovation, in charge of coordinating the Global Swissnex network. Before that, he was working in the United States as a project leader for higher education and partnerships at Swissnex Boston, 2011-2013, and in Canada as science counselor at the Embassy of Switzerland in Ottawa, 2007 to 11. He studied history, political economics, and public management at the University of Fribourg, Switzerland, University of Ottawa, Canada, and the University of Paris, France. He is married and a proud father of two daughters. Mr. Hug, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. So without any further delay, I'm handing over the session to Mr. Hug. But before the session starts, I would like to inform you that all the attendees are in listen-only mode. Any questions in regards to the topic will be taken only in the Q&A session, which will be after half an hour. There is a question box on your control panel to park all your questions. Okay, so over to you, Mr. Hug.
Well, thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to this webinar with the Indian School of Public Policy. Thank you for inviting me to speak about Swiss innovation policy. So I'm going to pull up my presentation, and I hope you can see it. Is that correct? Okay. So today's title is Switzerland's recipe.
So I think students cannot see the screen right now.
I think now you can, I think.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. So what is Switzerland's recipe for success? And I actually would like to start with a chart, and I'll let you think for maybe a couple of seconds what the correlation could be between in this graph here. So you have obviously Switzerland top right, and then you have the United States, and you know, the various countries you see there, China on the bottom left. So what do you think does this graph represent? And I should add that it was published 2013 in the New England Journal of Medicine, so a quite reputed journal. I'm going to give you the solution right now. So in fact, it's the amount of chocolate consumed in Switzerland in relation to the number of Nobel Prizes we have. So basically, you could say the more chocolate you eat, the more Nobel Prizes you're going to win in a country. So maybe that is the recipe of success for Switzerland. Of course, this is a bit of a joke, but I think what I want to show with this graph is that Switzerland is known for, of course, its chocolate, its cheese, but it's much less known for being a leader in science and technology, innovation and education. And in fact, if you look at the different rankings, whether it's the WEF ranking or the Global Innovation Index by INSEAD, if you look at the different rankings, Switzerland is usually among the top, whatever, 5 or so. So this one is by the UN. So you take different rankings, and Switzerland is typically ranking pretty well. So of course, very often we get the question, and maybe I should add maybe just two words about the consulate here in Bangalore. We're actually a Swissnex, so meaning that we actually focus very much on innovation, science, and technology, and this is why we are here in Bangalore. So as a consulate here in Bangalore, our mission is to connect the dots in education, research, and innovation between India and Switzerland. And so we're being asked very often the question, why is Switzerland doing so well when it comes to innovation? Many people being surprised. And If you ask our former state secretary, his name is Dr. Mauro Dell'Ambrogio, he would usually give this answer here. So the policy we have is actually to have no innovation policy. And of course, that is a little bit surprising, probably. And of course, it's also to be meant to provoke a little bit. And I think in the next couple of 20 or so minutes, I would like to explore more in detail what he actually means by that. And I'd like to start actually with like three use case or three cases or three stories, if you want, of Swiss innovation. And as it was mentioned, my background is in history, so allow me to maybe go a little back in history without going into too much detail. But three stories which actually you can maybe relate to, because the first one is about cheese. And the first place I want to take you is actually maybe a place where you wouldn't expect innovation happening. And the picture you see here is Emmental, a very rural area, very close to Bern, the capital of Switzerland. So probably the last place where you would imagine innovation happening. Emmental actually is very famous still today, but more so in the past actually for its cheese industry. The Emmental cheese is typically what you would know abroad as Swiss cheese, and it goes back, of course, many centuries back. And today in Emmental you will find this small medium enterprise called Landtal. It's a company of around 600 employees, 250 in Switzerland, and the rest all over the world. And they have a pretty long history, actually. They actually go back to the 19th century when two brothers founded a company that produced the linen which you need to produce cheese. So the cheese industry then being really very dynamic, there was a huge need for linen to produce cheese. But of course, with industrialization and mechanization, those linens were used less and less. And so the company had to reinvent itself. And they actually would reinvent them in a very funny way. They actually would find the transportation sector as a really interesting industry where those linens were used. And so after the Second World War in Europe and in the US, you would have a boom of the airline industry. And so that is where then Landtal would find new customers. Landtal started producing linens, textiles specifically for the transportation sector up to today, actually, whether it's airplanes, whether it's trains or trams, buses, because it requires a specific quality of the textile. It has to be exchanged really quickly. If a textile is damaged wherever in the world, it will have to be exchanged within 24 hours. So today, when you will take the plane, and next time I'd like to thank you of this company, there's a 50% chance that you'll be sitting on a textile that was produced in Emmental. They have a 50% market share. The reason for that is actually the quality, but also like the business model where like the customer service is very highly rated. And I took that as an example for Swiss innovation because it speaks to the innovation landscape where small companies, small and medium enterprises in Switzerland actually play a key role, where they have to be innovative to survive. And more importantly, actually, they have to be very international. So 95% of Landtal's product are being exported. And in fact, should you ever have the chance to be flying on Air Force One with the President of the United States, you will be sitting on their textile as well. So very small company, but very innovative in its core. I'd like to move now to the second industry, again, industry which is traditionally known in Switzerland and everywhere in the world, the watchmaking industry. The watchmaking industry actually, which goes back also again a couple of hundred of years, 16th century. What happened then is you had the Reformation happening and Protestants. So there was a schism with the Roman Catholic Church, and the Protestants were very much against any display of wealth. So in Geneva, you had actually, which was a trading hub at that time, you had a lot of gold. So a lot of traders who were trading with jewelry. And now suddenly they weren't allowed to sell jewelry anymore because of that the Protestant leadership in Geneva. So they reinvented themselves actually by, if you want, in some ways partnering up with the watchmaking industry of that time. And so out of a jewelry piece, you had a watch, and it being a watch, it actually was allowed to carry because it was no longer a piece of jewelry only. So out of that sort of combination and crisis emerged a watchmaking industry in Switzerland, where it was known for its design, but also for its quality. And then in the 1970s, so 500 years later, another thing happened in Switzerland. It was the invention of the electronic watch in the 1970s in Neuchâtel. However, even though it was invented in Switzerland, Switzerland sort of didn't manage to sell that very well. And in fact, the Japanese and the American watchmaking companies did much better. And the Swiss watchmaking industry actually plumped into a huge crisis in the 1970s and early 80s because suddenly you have watches made somewhere else for a much cheaper price, still very reliable. And so the traditional Swiss watch was no longer in demand. So what happened then is it was a person with an immigrant background, Nicola Hayek actually, who came in the early 1980s, and he reinvented the watchmaking industry by creating a watch which was also cheaper but still high quality and came in a very modern design. And most of you might know this watch. It's a Swatch, which you will also find in India and almost everywhere in the world. And with this Swatch, actually, that really revived the Swiss watchmaking industry. That being said, there was a huge unemployment still in the watchmaking industry, and you had a lot of skilled people, skilled labor actually, in high precision engineering that had to find another industry to apply their knowledge and their skills. And so with this pool of labor, which is highly skilled actually, they found a demand in another industry, which now is the medtech industry. And the medical technology industry actually was looking for this kind of skilled labor and was benefiting actually of their expertise and skills. So nowadays actually high precision tools, medtech again is one of the main industries in Switzerland, especially when it comes to export, to the export industry. So again, I think here the story is that you had moments of crisis in the Swiss economic history where the government actually didn't intervene too much. So it wasn't about protecting the watchmaking industry at any price, but it was really about investing into research. So in the case of the Swiss watches, they have invested in a research center in Neuchâtel, today called CSEM, which will provide necessary knowledge and expertise to really then take the watchmaking industry out of its crisis. And at the same time, actually provide the foundation for other industries to emerge. Now, a third example, we know cheese, we know watches, but we also know banks when it comes to Switzerland. And this is a bit of a more recent case. We don't have to go back too much in time to find the latest crisis, 2008, 9, everywhere in the world, the financial industry found itself in a huge crisis. And of course, it also affected the Swiss financial place. It was, again, banks like UBS found themselves in a big under big pressure. The Swiss government had to help a little bit, but I think what happened actually out of this crisis is what we had for a long time. The bank secrecy actually has been abolished in the meantime due to international pressure, and so nowadays actually the Swiss banking place is very much aligned with OECD standards. But that really put Swiss banking into a position where they had to ask themselves, for the financial place, where they had to ask themselves, okay, how do we remain competitive? How do we remain innovative? And so in this environment of crisis actually emerged another, I would say it's not another sector, but emerged a whole ecosystem around financial technologies, new financial technologies, or also called fintech. So today, when you read the headlines about the Swiss financial industry, you will find a lot about fintech. So here, for example, in Forbes, the headlines, forget chocolate, cheese, and watches. It's all about fintech in Switzerland. And so very recently, actually, a couple of weeks ago, Facebook actually has decided to set up its fintech fintech office in Switzerland, in Geneva. And even when you go to the heart of the Swiss financial industry, when you go to Zurich, you see really a very emerging and dynamic, vibrant blockchain industry coming up. Just last week, actually, I led a delegation of Indian policymakers, entrepreneurs, experts in blockchain to Switzerland to see what led to the emergence of that blockchain sector. And so, for example, when you look at Zurich, you have Trust Square, which is one of the largest incubator of blockchain, co-working spaces for blockchain companies. And that was co-founded actually by a former banker. You take the train, half an hour, you'll be in Zug. Zug is now named the Crypto Valley of Switzerland and of Europe. So you have many crypto companies, startups emerging there, a very vibrant ecosystem that has emerged over the last 5 years. And since we talk about policy, I think actually the policymakers played a very important role in that emergence of the fintech sector in Switzerland. Very early on, they recognized the potential, whether it's crypto, but also other fintech technologies for the financial industry in Switzerland. And very early on, actually, they have defined some guidelines, have brought in some clarity when it comes to regulation of fintech, and more specifically of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And their approach is actually one where you don't define many rules for every single case of cryptocurrency. For example, Liechtenstein is now in the process of publishing legislation which encompasses 450 pages, if I'm well informed. Switzerland takes a slightly different approach. So our approach is more about principles, about setting the right framework conditions. So there will not be a specific cryptocurrency legislation, but in fact there will be adaptations of current legislation to adapt for this new industry. I think one thing that policymakers have said is that they're very much in favor of pushing for innovation in the financial industry. So that means also they have quite a liberal stance. At the same time, what is absolutely key is to implement and insist very strictly on current regulations. So when it comes to KYC, so know your customer, when it comes to money laundering legislation, so that is being implemented very strictly also from the very beginning in this industry. So very clear legislation which kind of sets the framework, and this is a recent press release by the government, which sets the framework conditions, actually really helped this industry to be innovative. And I think with the word framework conditions is also like part of my answer to this first statement of the former state secretary. So Switzerland's innovation policy is to have no innovation policy. By that he means actually that you don't need a top-down policy, but what the role of the government in Switzerland is to set the right framework conditions. Framework conditions in which those different actors from those different industries can come up with innovation. So the Swiss government will not say that after a financial crisis that we have to invest into fintech. No, they will say that we need the right framework conditions, and then we see what entrepreneurs come up with, what kind of innovations they can come up with. 10 years ago, nobody knew, or very few people knew about cryptocurrencies, about blockchain. So it's really the drivers. It's really a bottom-up process in Switzerland when it comes to innovation policy. So I just want to look very briefly into what are those different framework conditions, or at least some of them. One important aspect when it comes to Swiss innovation is the very high R&D investments. So 3.4% of the GDP is invested into our R&D in Switzerland. And when you look where that money comes from, you see clearly that it comes from the private sector. So it's not so much the government that drives R&D, but instead they create the right framework conditions for industry, for companies to invest into R&D, whether it comes to IP regulation, whether it comes to having proper a very well educated workforce. So with that and with those skills, with this expertise, the private sector is encouraged to invest into R&D. And if you look over the last couple of years, there's been an increase every year into R&D investments. If you look at the different industries, of course, pharmaceutical is leading the list with the two big ones, Roche and Novartis in Basel, but then also the machinery sector. If you look at the food industry, if you look at high-tech instruments and high-precision tools, of course. So that is where a lot of the innovation and the R&D is being spent. Another factor, other than just investing into R&D, I think Switzerland has really the advantage of being small. Being small means this geographic proximity also allows for very strong and exchange between the different actors, so between the different industries and also with the regulators. So what I didn't mention before is that when it comes to blockchain legislation, there was a very how can I say, there was a certain openness from the government to speak to the different stakeholders, to speak to the industry experts, to understand what blockchain can do. And so when you have a certain geographic proximity, that of course allows for a better exchange. And if you look actually at Switzerland as a country, we are one of the leading nations, but when you look at specific cities, you will not find a specific Swiss city among the best 30 or so or most innovative innovation hubs in the world. So you have to look at Switzerland actually. So when you look at the ecosystem, you don't look at specific cities, but you look at Switzerland as a country. And in fact, when you take the train from Zurich to Basel, that is like a 45 minutes or 1 hour train ride. So it's like from the airport in Bangalore to the center. Or if you take the train ride from Geneva to Bern, for example, it's the same amount of time it takes you from the center in Bangalore to Electronic City. So so it's all very closely knit in Switzerland. And in that ecosystem, of course, a key role play universities. We have 10 academic universities 12 PhD granting universities. Out of the 12, 9 are among the top 200 institutions in the world. So there's also like a recognition of the Swiss government to invest a lot into education, into research, of course. And besides universities, we have also a very strong vocational education training system. So in fact, 70% of high school students go into a vocational program first, but then they have the choice later on to go back to university. So this maybe just some figures on the research in Switzerland. So if you look at the scientific articles per million inhabitants, so there's quite a high production, but more importantly, I think they have a lot of impact. And the reason I think why the quality of Swiss science is so good is because we actually, as a small country, have to, from the very beginning, collaborate internationally. So in fact, if you look at the number of co-publications with international authors, 80% of all co-publications in Switzerland are being authored with an international partner. So right from the beginning, we have to collaborate internationally. So I've been speaking, of course, now about all the sort of positive things, but there are, of course, some challenges when it comes to innovation policy. And so something which is even in Switzerland not that well known is a certain tendency which you will also see in other countries in the world, is that there's more and more R&D spending, but actually if you look at who is spending R&D, it's in fact the very multinational companies, those who are who have to compete with other international multinational companies, so such as Novartis or Nestle. So they have to invest a lot into R&D. But if you look actually at the small and medium enterprises, in fact, they're investing less into R&D in Switzerland. When they do invest into R&D, it is actually to reduce costs. So that is a bit of a concern in Switzerland because, as I said in the beginning, SMEs are actually the backbone of the Swiss economy. I think more than 90% of all companies in Switzerland are SMEs. So if they're not innovative, then in the long term, that will also affect Switzerland's capacity to be innovative. And especially those SMEs, actually, they see a high need to reinvent, to rethink their business models. So the current business models that they had before the whole digital economy came up actually has to be rethought, has to be reinvented, and that is one of the biggest challenges for them. From a policy perspective, I think what's really interesting is how do you regulate new technologies in a way that doesn't stifle innovation. On the contrary, actually, that encourages innovation. At the same time, regulation that ensures the safety of customers, ensures security. And so, for example, one example I would like to give here is the Swiss Post, so postal service. They're in fact one of the most innovative postal agencies in the world, and they have been doing various pilot projects with new technologies. So whether it's with autonomous bus, whether it's with drones, or with like a little robot. So if we take the example of drones, in fact, after a testing period of, I think, a year or so, they actually made that part of their services, and they're now bringing blood samples from research hospitals to labs. But what we see there is what happened a couple of months ago is that two of those drones actually crashed. And that, of course, undermines the society's trust in those technologies. So right now, actually, Swiss Post has stopped these drone flights until they have investigated why those drones have crashed. So nobody got hurt, but nonetheless, it made some headlines. Same thing with the robot you see on the left. So they have been testing these little robots will bring some samples, let's say from a medical shop to your home. You can order that online, and then this robot will go and get it for you. They have stopped actually the pilot project because legislation right now actually is not allowing for such robots to run independently. So in fact, when you send a robot like that, you have to have someone walking next to this robot, which quite frankly doesn't make much sense. So their regulation actually is a little bit behind, and there's a lot of debate on security, on safety of this type of technologies. So Switzerland is looking is having those debates like in many other countries as well, like here in India as well. And in some areas we're more advanced than in others. But there's a clear, I think, recognition with the Swiss government that we have to create legislation guidelines which encourage those technologies to be adopted at the same time that take into account the concerns of consumer groups and other people. So to finish maybe my presentation, I would like to say again that so when we say we have no innovation policy, actually the innovation policy is about creating right framework conditions. It's investing into infrastructure, whether that's education, whether that's research, whether it's the ecosystem in itself. So it's very much a bottom-up approach that Swiss policies encourage, rather than having a very top-down industry policy where the government decides which technologies should be specifically supported and which ones don't. So yes, with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I think we can now go over to the Q&A. So I think right now we don't have any questions yet.
I think it's been very clear to students about the topic, so maybe we don't have any questions. But we can wait for 5 more minutes. If there is no question, then we'll end the session. So for students who are attending, if you have any questions in regards to the topic, please text on our question tab. So Mr. Sebastian can actually explain it to you if there is any doubt, or else we'll end the session in another 5 minutes.
So there's one question from Mr. Saker. How do you think the difference in populations of both countries make a difference. Of course, you can't. I think, and it's also one thing that we tell our Swiss visitors that come here to India. You can't compare. The challenges or the environment in which India is compared to Switzerland. Switzerland has 8 million people. That is less than the city of Bangalore. So of course that helps in certain things. But I would say, for example, in the area of AI, when it comes to data, what we see actually that there's a lot of data being produced here in India, much more data than in Switzerland, given this 1.3 billion people. And for many people, that's actually a huge opportunity. And that's also where we at Swissnex actually see an opportunity to collaborate in AI and other technologies. So data is one area where I think India has a huge advantage, and where a lot of innovation can happen, and where I think a lot of international collaboration can happen as well. So there's another question. How is the education system in Switzerland? So not quite sure which aspect you're referring to, but maybe just one important aspect of the Swiss education system that I briefly mentioned in my presentation is that so we go to high school until the age of 15, and after that students will have to decide whether they were going to go for academic track, and so about 20-25% of Swiss students, high school students, decide to go for this academic track and then go to what we call college or gymnasium, so more like a general education. But then 70% or over 70% of those students decide to go for vocational education training. So they spend 3 days, 3 to 4 days in a company learning the specific skills in their industry, whether it's a carpenter, whether it's in a bank, and then 1 or 2 days they spend in school, learn new languages, learn the theory behind that. And so having this combination of work-based training and then more school-based training is one of the key aspects of Switzerland's education system. On top of that, those apprentices, they do apprenticeships of 3 to 4 years. So then they have a very excellent insight into a specific industry, but then they still can go back actually to higher education, can go back to university, and in fact at the age of 25 or so have both professional experience, very good knowledge of the industry, and have the academic background. So, and I think this what we call the VET system actually has been one of the key pillars of Switzerland's innovation success. What are the opportunities in higher education in Switzerland? So maybe I can recommend you to go to a website which is called studyinswitzerland.swiss, I believe. So it's a website which gives you overview of all the different opportunities. So we have a lot of international students. Some universities have up to 30% of international students. So I think that kind of shows the interest of what Switzerland has to offer to foreign students. What steps should India take for innovation betterment? So I'm not sure it's up to me to give advice how India should run its innovation policy. I think our role is to encourage for exchange. And so, for example, as I mentioned, last week we actually took a delegation of Indian policymakers from VCs and experts, also from academia, to Switzerland to show them how blockchain policy works there. And then, so they will see, which aspects of that policy can be applied or could be beneficial here in India, and which ones simply could not be applied. But maybe one thing I think that is key in Switzerland, and probably for any country, I think, is the investment into education. So having a very good education system, primary, secondary, and then having a very well-funded higher education system really sets the foundation, I believe, for any kind of success in for the economy or for innovation, and that is probably true for any country, I would say. I was thinking about the advent of AI and the policy interventions related to the change over AI. So I'm not sure I understand correctly the question, but as I mentioned before, I think AI is one of the areas where India actually is really advanced, and I think where India can play a key role also worldwide with the amount of data that you have here, with the IT expertise you have, whether it's in Bangalore or other cities, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Pune. So I believe that that yes, I mean, you can play a key role. I think Niti Aayog has published recently a very important report on AI that sets sort of the framework conditions, and I hope that through this by supporting AI mentioned in India, we can then also further in the Swiss collaborations in that area. So how the framework approach work for unorganized sector in terms of policy. So I'm not quite sure what you mean by unorganized sector. So maybe you could give me some more hints there. So maybe I quickly skip this question, can come back later. So how you think India can make use of its geography in developing tech infrastructure? Well, India is a huge country, so of course very different than Switzerland. But I think what we do see is infrastructure in itself in a city plays a huge role in promoting innovation, in bringing people, talent to your city. I would say, for example, Hyderabad, I was very much impressed in the infrastructure development they had there, and the support they gave to the ecosystem. And so having industry clusters is definitely a good thing. As I said, geographic proximity is very important. Just to give you an example, something very banal, actually. I also used to work 2 years in Boston, and so we were very often on the campus of MIT, and they used to have this Cambridge Innovation Center, CIC. And actually, the place where connections happened, where people talked, people never met before, was the cafeteria. So it was a cafeteria area which was in the center of this incubator. And the same is around the Cambridge Innovation Center. You had a lot of restaurants, pubs, cafes, places where people could hang out. So when you build infrastructure to promote innovation, you don't just build sort of like a techno park and with closed offices, but you also have to build areas around which encourage exchange, informal exchange, and I think that's hugely important. So it's not only a place where you work, but it's also a place where you hang out. It's a place where you meet friends. It's a place where you want to be and spend your time. And I think that is really important when you want to build infrastructure around innovation. Okay, so there are a lot of questions now. Why are Swiss too innovative, but India is too lag behind from many countries? How India can improve yourself? Well, there I would like to say actually that what I see in India, or I'm here in Bangalore, based in Bangalore, is that there is already a lot of innovation happening. There is a lot of talent. Of course, not everywhere in the country, but I find it very encouraging to see the innovation that India brings out. So I mentioned earlier, I think to have maybe a broader foundation to encourage innovation. I think that foundation is education. So you have to, I think any country does well if it invests into education, when it invests also like in other types of learning, such as I mentioned before, VET, so work-based learning, is extremely important in Switzerland. So I think, again, education is the key here. So that is a similar question. So what is your opinion on smart cities? What is Switzerland doing towards it? So, well, smart cities, it's a big topic. Again, I would like to come back to what I said before, actually. I think a smart city is a city where people want to live. Uh, it means having public space where people come together. So it's not just about technology. Of course, technology can help to save, to address some challenges of cities. But I think more important than the technology around it is the urban design around it. So how do you create public spaces where people want to be? How do you create a space which is safe? How do you create a place that is sustainable? So, for example, if you look at Switzerland, maybe just to give you one example, Bern is the city where I lived for the last 4 years. Maybe 30 years ago, Bern too, like many other Swiss cities, were fighting with pollution of lakes and pollution of rivers. So we're highly polluted. We would have foam. You would find foam on the rivers, and so the policymakers then took steps to address that issue. And one step was, of course, investing into research, and then another step in translating that research into policy recommendation and policy implementation. Today, one thing that me and my family actually made us stay in Bern, and one thing that really appreciated was that after work and sometimes even during lunchtime, we would go to the river called Aare, and actually would go into the Aare and swim down this river. So the quality of life, just by having this option of being in the nature, going into the water, actually really made us decide to stay there in Bern. And so I believe that any city that wants to invest into innovation also has to invest into the quality of life. So probably more important than the technology around the city is really to address maybe some challenges with regards to sustainability, with regards to quality of life through research and technology. Thank you. Well, thank you. So another question from an environmentalist point of view: how has Switzerland ensured it has fostered innovation without much damage to the natural ecosystem in terms of environmental protection laws and regulations? So I think I just gave you an example where Switzerland, also like industrialization, has led to pollution, of course, in Switzerland as well. I think one thing that I should mention is that India, or especially cities like Bangalore, have seen a huge change, a growth that I think no Swiss city has ever seen. In 15 years, the growth you've seen in Bangalore is immense. So I'm not sure you can compare Swiss cities with Indian cities. That being said, I think there have been challenges in Switzerland as well when it comes to the environment. And so one way of addressing those was, as I mentioned before, is by creating research institutions that look into those problems. So whether it's water, whether it's forests, and so then also making sure that this research, which is done in those academic institutions, is taken out of those academic institutions, is being translated for policymakers, but not only for policymakers, but also for the communities, for the citizen, which is living in those cities and villages. So I think one topic, for example, that we also work is science communication. How do you communicate the science that is happening in universities in a way that is understandable to the everyday citizen? So I hope I can partly answer your question with that. Are there any examples of innovations driven by the government? Well, I would like to say maybe one innovation. So typically government is not the place where innovation is happening. But actually one example that I would like to give is ourselves, Swissnex. Swissnex actually was, if you want the dimension, was the first science consulate in the world. This concept hasn't existed anywhere else in the world. So the concept of creating spaces where people come together, where the government actually plays the role of a platform for connecting Swiss with US or Indian or Chinese researchers, and a model based on a public partnership model. So anything we do, actually, we do in collaboration, in partnership with universities, with private industry, with think tanks. So we are partly funded by those organizations. And this is actually something, again, that happened bottom up. So it wasn't a decision taken by Parliament or by a senior bureaucrat, but actually it was an idea that came from a colleague of ours, the science attaché at the Swiss embassy in Washington, who said, what am I doing in Washington? Science innovation is happening in Boston, in San Francisco. That's where we have to be. That's where the Swiss government has to play a role of connecting and helping Swiss researchers to tap into those innovation hubs. And so he came up with the idea. He found the funding. Again, the Swiss government gave him the support, but so more by giving him the framework in which then he could develop this idea further. So again, I invite you to maybe also have a look at our website at swissnext.org, which explains this history more in detail. Would cyber policies be a strong focus of collaboration between India and Switzerland in the future? That's a very good question. We briefly looked into that. It is an area which is very, of course, sensitive. I think, for example, the Israelis are doing a very good job. I mean, they're very strong in that area, and I think also connecting well with the Indian ecosystem. The Swiss ecosystem, not so much. We are looking into that. Again, it's a very sensitive area, so collaborations are even more difficult to encourage when it comes to matter of national security or even security of a company. So I would say it's not maybe the most obvious place for collaboration, but it could be one with potential. What opportunities are there for Indians in Switzerland, and especially in business? Can MBAs be absorbed in fintech startups, and what legalities of visa and documentation occur? So I don't think I want to go into the details of visa requirements, so that you can see on the website of the Swiss embassies. There are a couple of actually, when we were in Switzerland last year for this blockchain tour, we have met 2 Indian entrepreneurs in blockchain. So I'm not sure whether they had an MBA or not, but those were entrepreneurs that were part of an incubation program of CVVC in Zug, and so they have found a place to work in, find a way to work in Switzerland. And an MBA in itself, I think, will not make the defining difference. It will be more your specific skill that you will bring to whatever company you want to work for. So there are also many Indians that work for multinational companies such as Roche or Novartis, or as I said before, there are also entrepreneurs that went to Switzerland to run their company. How can we have a good career in policy making immediately after graduation? So this is a bit of a different kind of question. So I studied myself public policy, as was mentioned, and I was lucky. And I think maybe just one advice. I think that one thing that helped me really to start my career was having a very good boss. I think a boss that really supported me, that was more of a mentor to me, that believed in me, that gave me freedom to develop my own projects, that gave me guidance. Who also let me go when I had to go. So I think throughout my career, I think I always had I was very lucky with having the bosses that I had that had very different qualities, very different styles of leadership, but that always believed in me, that always gave me the freedom that I needed. And so I think whether it's in policy or in any other area, I think that is one of the key factors that really helps you in your career. So how can India improve its R&D sector? So I think I partly addressed that with talking about education. I think there is a lot of happening in India when it comes to R&D, especially here in here in Bangalore. I think IP regulation, of course, is something in Switzerland which is seen as a factor which really encourages companies to invest into R&D. So if I want to say one thing here is really, I think it has to be driven by industry, by the private sector. That is one of the key factors, I would say. And there, maybe India can do a little bit better. So the private sector investments. Please also suggest some case study or article to read. So I'm not quite sure in what respect. So how important role play when theoretical and practical aspects connect with each other? Isn't this a difference in the education policy of Switzerland and India? Yes, probably it is a difference between the Indian and the Swiss education system. As I said, the VET actually is really important in training, in developing a very highly skilled labor force in Switzerland. And not only highly skilled, but like skills that are actually sought after by companies. So having this practical knowledge is hugely important. I would say today, if I went back to the age of 15, I actually probably would decide to go for a VET training because I think those students who go through a VET program at the age of 19 or 20, when they graduate, actually they're much more mature, have a much better insights into the needs of industry. They know how to speak to a customer, and that is hugely important in nowadays world. So absolutely, I think that is something. What is the difference? And I think also like where India actually is investing a lot into skills development. So I think India is doing already quite a bit in that area now. So I'm skipping a couple of questions which I have already. Is there a startup visa issued by Switzerland for entrepreneurs? There's no specific entrepreneur visa, unfortunately. So which places we should intern to have experience in policy making, and which organizations apply for internationally. So again, I think more important than the organization where you're working is actually, I think, really the boss you're working for. The organization, I think, is actually secondary. Of course, it has to be in the field of your interest or something that you can see yourself into. But you could be working in an excellent organization which is very prestigious, but have a boss which really doesn't allow you to develop your faculties, your skills. So then I would say, again, it's more important to work in a place where you really appreciate the team and the boss. There hasn't been much discussion about job opportunities after all the education in Switzerland. So if I understand the question correctly, it's about job opportunities for students who studied in Switzerland. So maybe there I should say that the unemployment rate in Switzerland, also when it comes to recent graduates, is really low. I think it also has to do again with this VET system, where in the VET system you actually train the skills that are really needed by the industry. So industry most of the time actually has no problem to finding the skills they need. So what are the fundamental policies for preventing cyber crimes like digital banking fraud? So I think that is that's a bit too specific. I don't think I can really answer in detail. But again, it's basically the application of the current legislation in Switzerland, and so a very strong KYC in Switzerland is now absolutely key when it comes to digital bank frauds and such. What are the best methods to fetch foreign direct investments? So I think there are many methods. There are many reasons how or ways to fetch foreign direct investments. I think in Switzerland, again, one key factor is the political stability, it's the kind of infrastructure that we're providing, it's the quality of life, which is very important, it's the education system. So it's it's a whole basket of different aspects that are important and are the reason for international companies to invest into Switzerland. And I would say it's very similar here in India. When you ask Swiss companies investing in India, or let's say investing here in Karnataka, one reason very often mentioned is the talent that they will find here. So I think criteria are somewhat similar. So I think I went through all the questions. So I hope I could answer your questions in a way that you're happy with. If you have any questions, further questions, do not hesitate to write to info.swissnexindia.org. This is the address of our Swissnex office here in Bangalore. On our website, you also will find the kind of events and activities that we're doing here in Bangalore, and maybe, hopefully, maybe one day we can meet in person here in Bangalore.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hug. It was such an insightful session, I guess, for
Thank
every
you.
student. I'm sure this adds value to all the attendees. For all the
Definitely.
attendees, a recording of this video will be shared to everyone for future references. You can also find the webinar with other such webinars on our Twitter handle, on our YouTube handle, which is ISPP in Motion. You can write to us at contact@ispp.org.in for any queries. We'll connect to. I'm sure, Mr. Sebastian, if we can connect you with some other questions which
Sure,
student
of
might
course.
have in future, and hope to see your guidance from there. And for admissions in Indian School of Public Policy, the last day to apply for our final round, which is round 4, is 30th of June. So apply soon. Have a great weekend, and thank you so much, Mr. Sebastian, again for such a very like, insightful session
Thank you.
on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you.
having me.